It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large with Warner Lewis. 60 minutes of smart talk radio with interesting guests from all walks of life begins right now. So sit back and enjoy. And now, from the flight deck, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment is certainly no exception. The subject is children. That always perks our interest. Alfie Kohn is a well-known authority on human behavior, education, and parenting. He's written numerous books. The most recent work, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom About Children and Parenting. With that as a brief introduction, Alfie, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Good. We appreciate you being here. Boy, when you say children and parenting, it is a lightning rod for all kinds of opinions, is it not?
It is, and unfortunately, people are often not so humble about their opinions. They make assumptions about what kids are like and how they should be raised, what parents are doing wrong, often without good evidence to support those. So I decided to do some research and figure out whether there was any truth behind what many people believe is true.
Well, one of the things, people that have read your work, but if they're not familiar, you are sort of considered an outspoken critic of education's sort of fixation on grades, test scores, those kinds of metrics. Give us a little bit of your background, first of all, and why this subject is so important and has been so important to you.
Well, I've been writing and lecturing about education, as you point out, as well as parenting and human behavior more generally for a number of years now, and I've written books on all sorts of issues. Almost 10 years ago, I wrote a book for parents called Unconditional Parenting that kind of challenged a number of the approaches we're encouraged to take with our kids. The subtitle of that book is Moving from Rewards and Punishments to Love and Reason. But I began to notice that the mainstream wisdom in our country about kids has come to be a series of deeply conservative assumptions driven by ideology that says parents, on the one hand, are supposed to be too permissive and indulgent, and yet on the other hand, somehow, they're supposed to be overprotective and helicopter parents. And that kids, from little children all the way to young adults, are supposedly narcissistic and have inflated self-esteem. They're entitled and spoiled. Just about anything negative you can say, people are saying. And what's interesting is that even people who are more politically centrist or liberal tend to assume a bunch of very deeply conservative beliefs about what kids are like and how they should be raised. And that's what I try to dig into more deeply in the book.
What give us a little bit of a historical perspective in the research that you've done. Has that view changed quite a bit over time?
No, amusingly, it hasn't. And in fact, that's a powerful rebuttal to the claims that are made now. So I start The Myth of the Spoiled Child with examples from contemporary articles and books saying that kids today, don't have enough chance to fail, and they get everything too easily, and they're spoiled and think too highly of themselves, and parents don't set limits, and they protect them too much, unlike the good old days when we were being raised. And then I go back a generation and find examples of exactly the same things being said 20, 30 years ago, contrasting that time with what went before it, and I jump back another generation to find the same thing being said all over again. So not only is there no good evidence to suggest that kids are more like this today than like another way, or parents are more permissive today than non-permissive, but claims certainly have no basis, in fact, when we say that all of this is different today than it used to be. And our first challenging piece of evidence is that back then people were saying the same thing.
Well, the fact that we are sort of history repeating itself, whether we admit it or not, I'm curious just from your standpoint, do you feel overall that our general approach to parenting is a good one, and however you define good, is it effective? And if it's in need of change, what's your premise, so to speak, or what's the fundamental change that might need to be made?
Right. Well, to To challenge assumptions and accusations about parenting, which is what I try to do in the book, is not to say that I approve of the standard or default models of parenting, because I don't. But my concern comes from the opposite direction. I believe parents are so afraid of being thought permissive that they overcompensate by being too controlling. And while the mechanism of control may have changed, so that maybe kids today are more likely to be controlled with rewards or praise rather than just with a spanking, though spanking, that is to say, physical violence on children when we think they've done something wrong is still remarkably common in this culture. Even though the method may have changed, the goal is still control and compliance. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that what that mostly does is make kids more self-centered, because now they're thinking about the punishment that they will get or avoid, the reward that they'll get for jumping through the parents' hoops. And they're less concerned about other people's needs. They also rewards and punishments and other forms of control, by failing to support kids' need to have some sense of autonomy, often really ruptures their relationships with us, so that they become less likely to see us as caring allies and more likely to see us as enforcers. That whole traditional approach to parenting doesn't help kids become more moral. It just leads kids to do whatever they think they have to do to get the goodie or avoid the punishment. I call all of that a doing-to approach to parenting. And many people apply it just because that's the way they were raised, even though sometimes the effects aren't all that positive. And I contrast it with a working-with approach, which is not permissiveness, which I don't approve of, but is something more respectful of kids. And when kids do something wrong, it's seen as a problem to be solved together, rather than an infraction to be punished.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. And, of course, we are in the middle of an interesting segment here with Alfie Kohn, a former teacher himself, highly regarded on the subject of human behavior, education, and parenting. His works have appeared everywhere from Psychology Today to the Harvard Business Review. We're talking about the general subject of parenting, which flows naturally, of course, into the subject of schooling and just evaluations, etc. I'm curious as to, do you see, are we evolving at all, or again, are we continuing just to repeat what we've always done, and it's just the nature of who we are?
It depends what you mean by who's we, and with respect to what?
Okay, let me narrow it down. In the United States, as a former teacher yourself, do you see today's children being educated philosophically where they should be, what tweaks might need to be made, or are we in essence teaching in the same manner we always have?
More the latter. This is a topic I've written about in other books. It's not so much what I'm talking about in this book, but I'm always happy to expound on it. I think that there is a relentless traditionalism about many aspects of education that has never served the interest of kids. For example, it continues to be the case, as it was when I was in school and when my parents were in school, that kids are segregated by age, which really doesn't make much sense, that different topics are segregated, different disciplines. So you do some math, and then the bell rings, and then you move on and you do some history, instead of looking at questions and problems that incorporate many different disciplines. Kids are rated and ranked, punished and rewarded, given grades and tests, even though the best schools don't need or use grades or tests. They use more informative and constructive ways of assessing learning. Kids have very little to say about what they're learning and how. They're often set in competition against one another instead of being encouraged to collaborate and learn with and from one another. And there continues to be an emphasis on cramming a bunch of forgettable facts into short-term memory instead of thinking deeply and skeptically and critically and creatively about issues that matter. There are happy exceptions in many classrooms and schools that point the way to a more effective way to teach. But by and large, what I've just described continues to be the norm, and it continues not to serve our kids or our democracy well.
How do you respond to those that say, the minute they walk across that stage and get that diploma from wherever they graduate from, they're going to face a brutally competitive world that doesn't care many times, rightly or wrongly, about collaboration. It doesn't care, in some cases, frankly, the depth of your knowledge and simply the quality of your skill and ability to, quote, get her done. It may be short-sighted, it may be limited, but how do you answer that?
By saying that little coda you threw in at the end, it may be short-sighted and limited, is exactly the point. It may be that there are dysfunctional organizations, including companies, that don't care about the ability to think creatively and with innovation, and to want employees who love what they do and are only concerned to get her done and turn out the end product and follow orders. But I don't want to create a school system to turn out people to staff bad organizations. I want to prepare kids who are ready for what good organizations are looking for and to change organizations in our society for the better. However, having said all of that, even bad companies have to acknowledge that employees often don't know how to work together. They're so rivalrous, so concerned about making sure that they step on everyone else's face, that they don't know how to do the kind of teamwork and cooperation that turns out to be more effective for the whole organization. To which I respond, where the heck would they have learned that if they've just gone through a school system filled with awards assemblies, spelling bees, and grades on a curve, where they were taught that everybody else is a potential obstacle to their own success?
Again, if you just joined us, we're talking to Alfie Kohn, brand new work called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom about Children and Parenting, a well-known authority on education, a former teacher himself. Alfie, let's talk about The Myth of the Spoiled Child. Its very title probably is a lightning rod for some people. Talk to us a little bit about the premise and why now? Why this book now?
Well, the premise, as we talked about a few minutes ago, is based on a bunch of assumptions about what children are like and how parents don't discipline them enough that turn out not to be supported by good evidence. Why now? Well, that reflects, I guess, just the evolution of my own thought and interests. I'm always interested, I guess, when what we believe and do is discrepant with, is inconsistent with what I believe good values and good research suggest makes more sense. So I've written all kinds of books where I say, even our own long-term goals for our kids pull in one direction, but our day-to-day practices with them often pull in another. And so we may have to swallow hard and rethink what we're doing. So I heard enough people making these claims about kids who have inflated self-esteem and they need more self-discipline and grit, and they don't experience enough failure, which is good for them, and parents are, on the one hand, too permissive and on the other hand, too overprotective, that I wanted to see if there was good evidence to support those claims. And I didn't, so I wrote a book.
Curious as to, you do a lot of traveling, you do a lot of speaking, you talk to educators, you talk to parents. What overall, from, let's just say, sort of the traditional school districts, the traditional school administrators, teachers, et cetera, what kinds of reactions are you getting?
Well, that depends on whether I'm talking to a self-selected group who come out to hear me because they know who I am. They tend to be very supportive. Right. Or talking to, a whole school district, which I sometimes do. I've done that in Kansas and elsewhere. And there's quite a range. There's a range of opinions, not only in terms of whether people agree with me or disagree with me or somewhere in the middle, but a range with respect to different issues. So, for example, even some people who are a little bit put out by my suggestions that we give kids more say about what they're learning because they think I should be in charge. Nevertheless, nod vigorously and applaud enthusiastically when I talk about the whole standards and testing corporate version of school reform that is squeezing the intellectual life out of our schools and turning them into glorified test prep centers. So people who are more traditionalist on some views of how you teach, nevertheless, are in alignment with me about that. So that's a long-winded way of saying it varies.
What is the, again, from where you sit, how supportive is our culture of education overall? And compare us, maybe if you could, somehow on some kind of a bell curve, I guess, compared to the balance of the world.
Well, I'm not an expert on international education, and I certainly would never want to rank or use anything like a bell curve because we already get too many of those rankings, that the U.S. is only number 11, and we want to be number 1 as if this was a sports match, the implication of which is that we want children who live in other countries apparently not to learn well, which I find to be an intellectually and morally bankrupt position. It's not a race. But here's what I do find is that in the U.S., which is where I was born and raised, where I spent most of my time, there seems to be a support for education that is far greater for privileged people than for working class people and those who are struggling, because we fund most of our schools by local property taxes, so there are huge disparities in the amount of money that's made available. And there tends to be a focus on education as just a means to the end of making a lot of money when you graduate. We tell kids, stay in school, you'll get a better job. And research shows that the more you talk to kids like that, the less interested they are in learning for its own sake, the less likely they are to persist, because they've been taught deliberately and explicitly, and other times more subtly and implicitly, that education is just a meal ticket. It's not about the value of being a lifelong learner, of learning to ask questions, of being skeptical, of diving into literature that can grab you by the throat, to think scientifically about questions, and learning the difference between what scientific evidence shows and what ideology based just on belief may suggest. We don't tend to do that very well. And we tend to reduce the quality of education to test scores, and standardized tests measure what matters least. I don't care if it's a one-size-fits-all test coming out of Washington, D.C., or a test coming out of just your state. If it's kids just memorizing facts and filling in bubbles on a multiple-choice exam, that tends not to tap the intellectual proficiencies that matter most. So when we hear politicians from both parties and giant businesses and their executives just talking about test scores and just talking about education as if it were about economics and gross national product, to me that says we don't really value education for its own sake. And we don't value teachers much either, who are widely and unfairly blamed for problems that are really more deeply rooted in our whole political and economic system. It's very different in many other countries where a lot of people really want to be a teacher, and it's difficult to become one, and they're widely respected for what they do for their society.
Has the role, in your opinion, of college and graduate work, has that changed? Is it becoming more important, less important, and does it suffer from some of the issues that you've been talking about our traditional public education?
I don't consider myself an expert on that, and again, it's taking us even farther afield from this book.
Okay, well,
but what I can say is that it's becoming increasingly unaffordable, and that necessarily changes the way people view higher education as something where people have to go deeply into debt in order to do, and so that makes them more focused on money than on a liberal arts education. And it necessarily leads people to have kind of a consumer mentality about, what am I getting for my dollar? And it's different in other in other countries. It's in Scandinavia, for example, college education is free, and there's just a commitment as a society. We're going to use our national treasury to support education and make sure that just being rich is not a qualification for being able to get a college education.
All right. Well, if it was up to Alfie Kohn, and based on the writings in The Myth of the Spoiled Child, if you could wave a wand, give us some things that would change, and maybe even on a more practical basis, some first steps that can happen to affect change here.
With parenting?
Yes.
I would say first, we as parents should think about our long-term goals for kids. How do we want them to turn out even after they've grown up? And I go all over the country and ask people that question, and I get very similar answers wherever I go. I want my kid to be happy, to be ethical, to be responsible, and compassionate, and a lifelong learner, and successful, and so on. So then the question becomes, what kind of parenting helps kids to grow into these good people? And here's where I argue that a lot of traditional practices that we often mindlessly reproduce from the last generation don't work very well. It's not just that they're unpleasant, that they're unproductive. Punishments and rewards make it less likely that kids will be responsible and ethical and happy and will have a good relationship with us when they're old enough to choose whether they spend time with us. Or I'll just focus on one small aspect of this. Kids learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. So if we want kids to be good decision makers when they're older, not only to be assertive and independent, but to be thoughtful about the choices they make, then we have to be willing as parents to give up some control. Not to abdicate our parental role, but to see that role differently, to be more people who work with our kids and give them as many choices as possible instead of telling them what to do and what to believe so that we can remake them into our image. That tends not to be very effective.
What about, again, as we begin to wind down here just a little bit, as you were doing this work, was there, and doing the research and compiling all this, was there anything, a premise, thesis, or theory, et cetera, in your mind that was, your mind was markedly changed as a result?
Yeah, I like that question. In fact, on call-in radio shows, I wish more interviewers would invite their callers to think about how their minds might have been changed by what they've heard, rather than call in to tell us whether you agree or disagree, which assumes that you couldn't possibly rethink it or learn. For me, I guess I was really surprised to find that helicopter parenting, which we read about so much in the press, is both less common and less damaging than we've been led to believe. So that was something that really surprised me. And I think another issue is with self-esteem. I had known of evidence showing that high self-esteem, where people think well of themselves, not in a grandiose or warped sense, but are basically positive about themselves, is good. But it turns out that what's more important than high self-esteem is unconditional self-esteem, which means you have, and you help your kids to have, a basic core or faith in your own value and goodness and competence, as opposed to people who think, I'm worthwhile only when I'm ... And it's that conditionality, that sense that you have to earn good feelings about yourself, which is very strongly endorsed by a lot of people, that turns out to be psychologically very destructive indeed.
Well, the work is sure to stir the drink for sure. The work is called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom About Children and Parenting. The author, Alfie Kohn, a well-known authority on parenting, education, and human behavior. Alfie, how can people find out more about the many writings that you've done and also get a copy of the book?
Well, they could go to my website, which is just my name. If you can spell it, you're there. It's Alfie, A-L-F-I-E, and the last name is K-O-H-N, Kohn, alfiekohn.org. brings you to lots of free articles that I've written on many of these topics and a description of this book along with other books, too. Thanks for asking.
You bet. We certainly appreciate your time and your insight, and would like to have you back on again.
Thanks so much for your interest.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.